We hear from a lot of veterans who will say, I wasn't in Vietnam, I wasn't in Iraq, none of this toxic exposure stuff applies to me. How do you respond to that misconception?
Well, I always have to analyze it piece by piece. You start with what condition do they have, where did they serve? One of the things that gets overlooked is how much chemical exposure there is on an ordinary military base. I don't care, pick one, any military base. There's a relatively small former Air Force base in New Hampshire, the Pease Air Force Base. It was never a huge base, but the groundwater there is seriously contaminated from the firefighting foam they used to use. It's got all these forever chemicals in the water, and now there's more and more evidence that those cause certain kinds of cancers, other problems. You have to work back. You have to look at, okay, what's the current condition? Where do people serve? What are the potential links? And one of the things that I have to give the VA real credit for, they are now, they've been ordered to do, but they're carrying it out. They are now doing these, what they call TERRA memos, toxic exposure reports. And those have been a huge help in a number of cases where the VA concedes that the person was exposed to certain kinds of chemicals, solvents, gases, whatever.
I'm always amazed when I see nexus letters from medical providers who have specialized knowledge of these sorts of toxic exposures. The number of chemicals that are known and proven to be, for instance, carcinogenic, causing cancer.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Welcome to Victory Over VA. If you're a veteran struggling with the VA's disability system, or just want to make sure you're getting the benefits you've earned, you're in the right place. Don't forget to hit subscribe so that you never miss another episode that could change your life. I'm Christian Terrison, here with renowned veterans disability attorney Francis Jackson of Jackson and MacNichol. Jack has dedicated his career to helping veterans like you win the benefits you deserve, recovering millions of dollars for thousands of heroes. This podcast isn't just for veterans navigating the system, though. It's for their families, their friends, and anyone else who wants to stand shoulder to shoulder with those who've served. So stick around because we're here to make sure you get the support you need. Now, today's episode is on a topic that we've covered before, and that's environmental exposures, toxic exposures. But we wanted to dig a little deeper, go beyond Agent Orange or burn pits, which are some of the more popular, or more common, I should say.
More common, certainly, yeah.
More common exposures, to some that are discussed much less frequently, but that impact, a wide swath of the veteran population. So what are some other off the beaten path exposure hazards that you've seen?
Well, there's all kinds of stuff. The military, because of what they do, uses all kinds of chemicals of a whole, almost infinite variety. It's everything from jet fuel to solvents to cleaning fluids to the forever chemicals in the firefighting foam. There's just a list longer than my arm.
So for these lesser known exposures where there isn't, a list of presumptive conditions, things like that, how do they slip under the radar for so many veterans for so many years?
Well, the thing is, there aren't enough people exposed simultaneously to generate a big medical response. If you think about presumptions, there are presumptions for Agent Orange because it was so widely used that essentially everybody who was sent to Vietnam got exposed to it. And that's such a big number of people that the most common conditions arising from it, diabetes, for example, were pretty easy to map. You know, when you've got that many people as your base, it's relatively easy. But take jet fuel, for example. Now, jet fuel is bad stuff. Jet fuel can cause dementia. I mean, it's really bad stuff. But there aren't anywhere near as many people exposed to jet fuel for a long time as there were people in Vietnam exposed to Agent Orange, because the Agent Orange exposure turns out could be a lot shorter, but exposure to jet fuel over time is just bad, bad stuff.
Are there particular eras, duty stations, MOSs where veterans should be especially alert for toxic exposure links?
There are. You know, one of the things that was always a problem for Agent Orange up until recently, and still is in some cases, is the places it was used stateside. And there are a lot of other bases where lots of chemicals were used. One of the things that what you should always do in looking at a possible exposure case is look at the list of bases where the person served and look at which ones of those are now EPA Superfund cleanup sites, because those are kind of the worst of the worst in terms of the environmental impact. But you know, some of those bases are just a chemical cesspool. I mean, it's scary.
Asbestos exposure in the Navy in the era where they were using asbestos for insulation.
Yep.
Another area, radiation exposure.
Yep.
For, you know, again, Navy working on nuclear vessels or...
But not only Navy. I mean, there were stateside nuclear facilities. I'm blanking on the name, but it's now a reservation, not Indian reservation, a government reservation west, where they had all kinds of radiation. And we had a veteran who served there and got, oddly enough, basal cell cancer that invaded his jaw, lost his jaw, has a titanium replacement. I mean, it's just bad stuff. So, and there are all these just odd little pieces scattered around. But the thing about them is none of them affect millions of people, so you never get the kind of critical mass that would bring it to the level of getting a presumption.
Or inversely, they've affected so many millions of people that, you know, it tracks with the population's general cancer rates or what have you.
Well, that's sort of what happened with hypertension. It took a long time for VA to acknowledge hypertension as a presumptive condition from Agent Orange, just because it's so widespread in the population. But eventually, they were able to look at the population that served in Vietnam, and their frequency was so high, they said, well, okay, it's got to be presumptive.
Yeah. So I guess let's talk about the elephant in the room. When a veteran develops a serious illness years, decades after service, after the initial exposure, how do they even begin to establish service connection there? Where do you start?
Well, there are a couple ways to go at it. My personal preference is to start with one of the AI programs and say, is there any evidence of a link between whatever the veteran's condition is and exposure to whatever the veteran says he or she was exposed to? But you can be much more scientific than that. You know, once you break down where they served, you can look at EPA records in particular, those are always good, and see what the potential exposures were and start comparing that with, okay, what does the person have? Is there a match? You know, if you want to do it in a more sophisticated but somewhat more difficult way, you can go directly to the scientific literature and start looking at the medical literature for links between exposure to this and exposure to that and the current condition. But I have to say that the AI programs are so good now that usually you can get a quick sense of whether there's a
chance.
A reasonable chance of developing a theory.
Yeah. And as always, you know, if you're going to use the AI programs, don't put any personally identifiable information in there. Just ask in general terms. It will get you pointed in the right direction so that you can find those types of journal articles or studies that will, you know, support your case, support your claim.
And double check. keep in mind that
Triple check.
that sometimes AI makes things up.
Yep, it's true. We hear from a lot of veterans who will say, I wasn't in Vietnam, I wasn't in Iraq, none of this toxic exposure stuff applies to me. How do you respond to that misconception?
Well, I always have to analyze it piece by piece. You start with what condition do they have, where did they serve? One of the things that gets overlooked is how much chemical exposure there is on an ordinary military base. I don't care, pick one, any military base. I mean, there's a relatively small former Air Force base in New Hampshire, the Pease Air Force Base. It was never a huge base, but the groundwater there is seriously contaminated from the firefighting foam they used to use. It's got all these forever chemicals in the water, and now there's more and more evidence that those cause certain kinds of cancers, other problems. I mean, you have to work back. You have to look at, okay, what's the current condition? Where do people serve? What are the potential links? And one of the things that I have to give the VA real credit for, they are now, well, they've been ordered to do, but they're carrying it out. They are now doing these, what they call TERRA memos, toxic exposure reports. And those have been a huge help in a number of cases where the VA concedes that the person was exposed to certain kinds of chemicals, solvents, gases, whatever.
I'm always amazed when I see nexus letters from medical providers who have specialized knowledge of these sorts of toxic exposures. The number of chemicals that are known and proven to be, for instance, carcinogenic, causing cancer,
Yep.
that appear in so many different chemicals and compounds that, I mean, not only appear on military bases, but get used in
Daily in life, yep.
in everyday life.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing that cancers are not more epidemic than they are.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say, you mentioned at Pease Air Force Base there, the water contamination. Most of our viewers are going to have heard about Camp Lejeune and the water there.
Yep.
What lessons do those instances teach about proving toxic exposures in, let's say, less than famous situations, lower profile situations where, again, it's sort of the quiet problem over decades?
Sure. I think the real lesson is that every case has to be kind of taken apart and analyzed. The rules about proving service connection are relatively straightforward. You have to show something happened in service, you have to show a current condition, and you have to show a medical link between the two. So you're always working back from the current condition. Okay, if the person has this medical condition, what are the possible sources that contribute to it? It's like when somebody comes to us with a TBI claim, one of the things you have to ask is, okay, did you ever have a head injury in the military? Have you had a head injury since the military? And, I worked on one case a few years ago, and we ultimately won, but the gentleman had been in an auto accident before he went in the military, had a bad concussion, was hospitalized, recovered, seemed fine, went through his induction physical, no issues. Had another head injury, auto accident and head injury, while in the service. And after that, he got into trouble for making racist remarks. That was the first thing that got him in trouble. And then there were a series of other things. And ultimately, his enlistment was up, sent him on his way with a general discharge. But when the VA looked at his case, they didn't even consider that he might have a TBI. Here's a guy with a concussion before service, a second concussion in service, and they just blew right by that. The psychologist that they had evaluate him just completely ignored that. Totally. I couldn't believe it. But we ultimately established that, yes, his psychiatrist had written a letter, which the VA blew off, saying that he had a pre-existing condition that worsened in service. He didn't spell it all out for them, but he wrote a letter that said he had a pre-existing condition that worsened in service. And the VA just ignored it. They said, oh, they mentioned the letter and completely blew it off, gave it no credence. Sorry, I'm fulminating a little about the quality of the medical exam that he got, but it was just disappointing. I mean, any psychologist, certainly anybody who got as far as getting a PhD and getting licensed as a psychologist, should recognize that when you have a serious concussion and an apparent recovery, followed by a second concussion, the odds are astronomically high that it's going to cause a TBI. There's something about a second head injury that almost always results in symptoms. And I don't know why this psychologist just missed it, but he did.
For toxic exposures, can a veteran successfully rely on government reports or scientific studies, or will the medical nexus need to come from a medical provider? For instance, if they find something that says, yes, this chemical is linked to this disease, is that report enough if they can show they were exposed to that chemical and now are diagnosed with that disease?
The correct lawyer answer is maybe. as you know. I mean, it's always a toss-up. Sometimes that'll be enough to persuade a VA writer. Sometimes it won't. But what usually happens in those cases is if the VA is not persuaded at the initial claim, and often they're not, you can go in and develop it further, get more studies, get more evidence, get a specific medical opinion, and to show that, yes, in fact, that exposure was sufficient to be the potential cause of this problem, and it's as likely as not.
So we're almost out of time for today, but one thing that I wanted to ask about is VA's treatment of radiation exposure, nuclear tests, radar systems, cleanup operations. Does the VA handle those types of exposures differently from other environmental hazards or toxic exposures?
Well, some of them. In the PACT Act, there is some very specific legislation about certain kinds of radiation exposures. But the big problem with the VA is that in radiation cases, they typically rely on these radiation counter kinds of things that the service folks sometimes used. The problem is that if you talk to somebody who is actually involved in those activities, what they'll tell you is that people found it a pain in the neck. They didn't use them religiously. The counters probably seriously understate the actual degree of exposure. And so for the VA to rely on them, they get a false negative.
Okay. So can you find reports on the accuracy of the radiation counting devices, or do you need an expert to opine? Or
in those cases, you pretty much always have to have an expert.
Okay.
Because the VA is going to stick with that data point unless and until you really force them off it.
All right. Well, and on that note, that's all the time we have for today's episode of Victory Over VA. Thank you for watching. Please be sure to like and subscribe and join us again next week.
We hope we'll see you then.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.